Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at our webinar for this month, Standardized Testing Decoded, What Colleges Really Want versus What's Best for Your Kid. Um, I'm going to continue to admit people on the side, but I also want to welcome us into this space. And introduce myself. I'm Mackenzie. I've been with Signet for about 4 years, held a couple of different roles, but I work closely with our tutors and with our families. And I'm thrilled to kind of lead us through today's webinar to talk about standardized testing. I am joined by a wonderful group of panelists who are the experts in this. So I want to give each of them the mic for a moment and let them introduce themselves. So, panelists, could you please share your name, how long you've been with Signet, and your experience in test prep? Sheila, can you kick us off?
I sure can. Thank you, Mackenzie. Thanks for having me. So I'm Sheila. I am the CEO of Signet. And I've been with Signet for 16 years. So we feel real old. I got my start in test prep in 2004, maybe something like that. And took on lots of other things and then of course took over the company. Um, I have deep experience in test prep. I love talking about it with people. I also do a lot of work on the admission side, so I can kind of connect the dots between what's happening with your score and what might this mean for your applications.
Thank you. Holly, will you go next?
Oh, sure thing. And I'm unmuted, so smooth sailing. So I've been with Signet for 6 years now, which is exciting. I do work also in college admissions, academic coaching, and mostly humanities subject tutoring with a lot of writing work. Um, I enjoy test prep because I like helping people feel like gain confidence and tackle some of the doubts they may have about themselves to do something that can be really useful for their future. Um,
That's really beautiful.
Andy, it's
Andy?
you.
Yeah, I guess that leaves me. I'm Andy, as
Mm.
you can see. I've been with Signet coming up on 8 years. Test prep was what I started with, SAT, ACT, and over the years I've also done SSAT and IZ, which is for the smaller kiddos going into high school, and I've also done some GRE and GMAT, and I took the LSAT at one point. So I guess I sort of, but I've not taught it, nor will I ever. Um, I enjoy test prep for exactly the reason Holly said, but I also really get really nerdy about kind of cracking tests and figuring out, ever better and more efficient ways of approaching tests and then obviously handing those off to my students so that they can streamline and refine their strategies and just do better and better, hopefully.
Thank you all for those intros. It's wild to hear how long you've all been here at Signet. Today, like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about standardized testing, which I know is one of the most confusing and overwhelming parts of the college process, especially in recent years. We have policies changing, tests themselves have changed in the past 2 years. So there's a lot of noise, and my goal today is to help you cut through that noise and talk about how much test scores matter to colleges, the real differences between the SAT and the ACT, how to make a plan, and the timing of when to make a plan so that you can cut back on stress later on. Um, we are recording this meeting, so don't feel like you need to take a ton of notes, and we'll share the recording with you all afterwards. And if you have any questions along the way, please put them in the chat or jot them down. We will have time at the end for a question and answer section. Um, so with that, I'd like to kick us off by kind of zooming out and looking at the bigger picture and ask, how much do test scores really matter in 2026 in the world of admissions? And that's kind of a big question. But Sheila, will you kick us off with what you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to give you an answer that is, I know, very frustrating, but it depends.
Hmm.
Depends on the colleges that you're applying to. It also depends on what you're applying with. What do your grades look like? What are your extracurriculars? What's the rest of your application portfolio saying about you? And what can a test score add to that picture? Um, so, I mean, I know we're going to get into it, but it is complicated, and I really feel for parents trying to figure this out. At the same time, there are some really like blanket statements floating around out there, like testing doesn't matter anymore, or testing still matters, and they're all lying to you about it. Neither of those things are true. It really is this nuanced, unfortunately. But I know your kids have probably heard one or the other of those things and are holding on to it really, really tightly. So I know we're going to talk about our process towards the end of the call, but that can really do a lot to help dislodge some of those like tightly held assumptions about whether it's important or not. Um, so I still haven't given you an answer. I've set up a lot of caveats, but maybe Holly can slice through it.
Mhm. I'll just build a little on that same feeling. Like, so one of the if you don't have necessarily a sense of what your college list roughly looks like right now, it is going to be really hard to answer that question, as Sheila described, right? So there's certain types of schools that are requiring tests more and more. So the Ivies and Southern, Southeastern public schools, writ large. But so if you know that you're applying to those areas, then testing, yes, you should have a plan. You should be going for it. If you're not likely to apply there, then it's a lot more of the gray area of whether it helps your application individually. And then there's the whole chunk of schools like in California that won't even look at your test scores. Um, so with those broad areas, that might give you a starting point about whether it's useful. Um, and I like to tell people as well is once you have your list as well, you can look at what their average score ranges are, median sort of. So they'll often list, a 25 to 75 range of what scores look like. And that might give you a sense of how competitive you would need to be in order to make a dent in the, and improve your application. And that might clarify a little bit of what feels realistic. Um, there's still other pieces left, but I'll let Andy talk about some of that.
Oh, this is kind of above my pay grade because I don't do college admissions. I mean, I do help with the essay portion of the applications, but I always defer to my wiser, more experienced colleagues in these matters. So whatever they say.
It is a very nuanced process, what I'm hearing. And Holly, thank you for providing some color in how you can start to understand how the scores might impact how your score might impact your application when you're looking at certain ranges of schools. Um, and my next question, I think you answered that was going to be when does a test score help an application versus when does it actually not move the needle? Do you have any more that you can elaborate on with that question?
I could pop back in. Often if a student's score or grades feel lower than their capabilities and then a high test score that would demonstrate their capabilities can be a huge asset. So sometimes I have people think about like, okay, roughly what is your ranking in your high school class? You start thinking, I mean, a lot of them don't know, but if you do know, or if you have a ballpark sense of that, if you're in the top 10%, um, then your test score should be higher than 10% or above.
Mhm.
That's like roughly speaking. But if your GPA is like you're in the middle of your high school class, but you have these like spikes in ability and you know that you could test much higher, then a test score is likely to increase your candidacy, especially at schools like, if it's a tech school or very science oriented and you get a really high math score, that's something that can really increase your candidacy. So that part is outside of the schools, like very relative to the students' candidacy.
Thank you.
I
Sheila, do you have
wanna,
anything to add?
yeah, I want to jump in. Holly's exactly on the mark, of course, but I really want to talk about really high scores where a higher score is not going to move the needle anymore, right? I always run into students, particularly because I tend to work with like really high scoring students who may be aiming for a perfect score. Um, they want to move from a 35 on the ACT through it to a 36. And I'm like, this is a waste of everybody's time. It's not a material difference. Doesn't matter the college you're applying to, they don't care if it's a 35 or 36. Or on the SAT, which I tend not to tutor, which we can get into. But moving from a 1520 to a 1550, it's immaterial. Like it doesn't matter. It's not worth your time. There are other things you could be doing, I'm sure of it, that would move the needle. So you know, we want to make sure the test is reflecting the student's ability, might reflect a strength that is not reflected elsewhere in the application. Um, and then as Holly was indicating in her earlier answer, if their score is much higher than the median at the schools they're applying to, that's a strength, even at a test optional school. But there's this other little edge case that I really want to make sure that message gets out there because testing is not everything. So we can move on after you've hit a certain point.
And just so that everyone can hear from this answer from the experts, do colleges care about one exam more than the other?
Not at all.
Thank
No.
you. I know that that's a big misconception out there. I think some schools offer the PSAT and other PACT, and so students just assume that that's the best path to go. But in a lot of cases, the ACT might be a better fit. I do want to ask you a little bit about test optional policies as well. Um, can you talk us through what families tend to misunderstand about test optional policies?
I'll jump in to
Sheila,
start.
yeah.
Well, there are a lot of people who, I guess, maybe go back to those two like strongly held assumptions. If they're test optional, then a test score doesn't matter. Or the other side of it, they're saying they're test optional, but they're not really, right? And I will, to college's credit, there is a new thing category of policy that is test recommended. Blows my mind. We can get even more nuanced about all of this stuff. So there are colleges that will say test recommended when really they do want a test score, but they'll make do if you don't send one. So they'll say they're test recommended. But by and large, if a college says that they're test optional, they really are. And you can look at the data. We can show you how to see how many students applied with the test score and how many didn't, right? And then from that, you can also get a sense of, is it maybe, am I in better company if I submit a test score, right? And then you can also see the averages. But test optional doesn't mean they don't care about testing. If there is a strong score to show, that is always going to work in your favor.
Holly, anything else to add?
And just to absolutely underline, it's not a trick. You will be penalized for not submitting your scores if it's test optional. When they say optional additional essays, always submit those. It's so confusing, right? So when we say like test optional in real, whether that's in good faith, some optional essays and supplementary materials you should consider required if you want to demonstrate interest and really give yourself the best chance.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's a good call out. Now I want to get a little bit more concrete and talk about the real differences between the SAT and the ACT. I'm going to pull up a slide so that you all can follow along, but Andy, could you help us break down some of the key differences between the SAT and the ACT in kind of simple terms while I pull this up?
Yeah, of course. So I guess we could start with the similarities. They do cover a lot of the same ground and material, but they do so. There are differences there, but they do so in different ways. So it often comes down to a question of feel or fit. But to get us started with some of the objective stuff, as you can see, the structures are different. The ACT has 4 sections. The SAT really has 2. Each of those sections is divided into 2 modules. So, and then the other big thing with the ACT is there's a science section, which has recently become optional. I'm sure we'll talk about, we can talk about how to approach that decision. There's also an essay, which is optional. This is, I guess, our third kind of optional, which is the don't do it, right? So we have genuinely optional, wink, wink optional, and also don't even think about it optional. So that's the essay. The science, though, is genuinely optional, but you do want to think about it strategically. Um, they are roughly the same amount of time. And I always remind my students that before a couple of years ago, these tests were both longer. And so that they shouldn't complain that they have to sit down and focus for 2 hours. Of course, this gets me nowhere. Um, Another big difference in format is when the SAT changed format a couple of years back, they went all digital. It is also adaptive, meaning after you finish that first module in each section, if you do well enough, you move on to a harder module, which raises your score ceiling. Um, the ACT, which changed formats sort of following the SAT's lead last year, is offered both digitally and paper. It is not adaptive. And there is a material difference between digital and paper, or rather, I guess there's a digital difference because on the digital test, you get Desmos, which is a very powerful graphing calculator. It's built into the platform and frankly makes a big difference on the math section. Students who choose paper, in this case, will do so because they just do much better in terms of reading comprehension when they have a physical thing in front of them. So for English, the English section, the science section, and most of all the reading section. So that's a bit of a decision that comes up, but those are the things that you're weighing. Scores are exactly what you see. Um, the difference in reading is the SAT is one question per text. They're never that long, although the language is definitely more elevated. The argumentation is more sophisticated than you'll get on the ACT, which in this case and really throughout is generally more straightforward question for question than the SAT. Um, as you can see, they cover a lot of the same material. But one difference is, although they do, technically this is all true, the ACT effectively asks questions on a much wider variety of topics. So there are some niche topics that the ACT asks about that the SAT does not. I think of the ACT math section as sort of a mile wide and an inch deep, and the SAT is not quite the opposite, but smaller range of content, but more difficult questions that you have to sit with, maybe reason around. The ACT is much more, do you remember this formula? Can you apply it in this situation? And even the hardest questions on the ACT, they're more like medium SAT questions. So that's one factor that we'll consider when figuring out what the best fit is for a particular student. Oh yeah, science. And just a bit about the science section in case that strikes fear into any of your kids' hearts. It's not really science. It's mostly data hunting, reading figures and charts and tables and graphs and things like that. Um, of the 40 questions, there'll be two or three or four that are outside science knowledge questions, basic things like the pH scale or what a nucleotide is, but there's no science being done. It's more of a reading section with a lot of visual aids that you have to learn how to read. So it's not as bad as it sounds, and it's not as bad as it first looks. It's also kind of intimidating to look at, but it's not so bad. There are many other differences, but I'll stop there, and we'll have time for questions, and we can elaborate as folks would like.
Sheila and Holly, off of this, and thank you first of all, Andy, for that run for that was really helpful. Sheila and Holly, do you have anything initially to add on the key differences between the two exams?
This is sort of buried in here, but on the SAT, you get much more time per question than you do on the ACT. And that's often one of the big kind of forks in the road when we're looking at which test is going to be better for a student.
Mhm. Thank you. Holly, anything from your end?
No, that was great.
Great. I kind of want to dig in more to the science section. As Andy mentioned, when the ACT changed their format a couple months ago, they made the science section optional. What do you think, how do you advise your students around whether or not they should take the science section if they do choose to go the ACT route? Sheila, I'll ask you.
Oh, I was going to say you should ask Holly first.
Oh.
Um, but now I'm talking, so I'll just talk. Um, okay, it depends. It's my catchphrase for today. But I can tell you on what it depends.
Mhm.
So, if your student is applying to a college with, let's say, less than 30% acceptance rate, and they want to submit an ACT score, they should be doing the science section, right? Even if the college doesn't specifically say science is required if you're going to do the ACT, their toughest competition is going to have the science section. And I want to make sure my students are prepared on all fronts. So if we're aiming for a selective college, um, we're doing it. No question around it. And the science section on the ACT is my favorite. It's probably the thing that keeps me tutoring the test. I love it. It's so much fun. So it's not impossible. Holly, what would you add?
I'd say that generally it's highly learnable, like the strategies, and that's the quickest way to get a bump, I think, for a lot of students. So I consider it a confidence builder, and I really encourage people to take it. It's offered last, so if you're worried about the length of the test and fatigue, it's not going to bring down the other scores that you have as well. So I don't necessarily see a lot of negatives toward taking it if people have their doubts. So it's not going to negatively affect your other scores. And a couple schools that if you submit the ACT, they want to see the science section, it's required. So Georgetown and BU being them. So I don't know if that is going to change more, if that's going to be increased over time. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, a good reason if there's some dream schools out there, make sure you research the testing policies and stay up to date on that. And that way, you've prepared and you don't have to let go of Georgetown because you didn't do the science section.
One other thing I want to add here is like a little bit above the level of what's on the test and how do you do it and what do colleges want is why this is optional in the first place. Andy, when you were taking us through this chart, you were saying the ACT changed in response to the SAT. Well, the SAT actually changed in response to the ACT first, and then the ACT had to change to catch up. These are two, not-for-profit companies that make a lot of profit that are competing for market share. And especially since COVID, when all these colleges went test optional, they lost, a huge revenue source. And so they're seeking ways to make these tests feel easier. They're not easy tests. Feel easier to students. They got them shorter. ACT figured out how to get their test shorter, but then they're like, we're still longer than the SAT. What's our edge? Oh, kids hate the science section or they think they hate it. They don't even want to look at it. So let's make that optional. And colleges didn't really put up a fight, which I was a little surprised by, but that's really what this is about. It's not about measuring any sort of real preparation for college level work. It's not measuring intelligence, certainly. These tests are changing to be better moneymakers and get more students. Just gonna say it plainly.
Thank you for walking us through that explanation. It is helpful to know the history of why these changes happened, since a lot of them were so recently done so recently. Um, Now, these are very different tests. They have similar components as we've mentioned, but can you tell us what type of student tends to perform better on the SAT over the ACT? Are there certain qualities that they might have? Andy, I'll ask you this one.
Sure. Yeah, the answer to that follows from the differences in the tests. So, so you can kind of imagine, and perhaps some of you, even just from that overview, already know which one your child might be better at. Um, but to bring it to pull it together, um, the ACT, yeah, one big thing I'm glad Sheila remembered to mention because I forgot. Less time per question, so it's a bit more of a rapid fire challenge. There are more questions as well. So um, if a student has a relatively good memory, because there are a lot of math formulas that you just have to memorize, and a relatively quick recall and is comfortable, just boom, 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 ACT is likely going to be a good fit. Um, on the other hand, the SAT, you have to memorize less on the math section, but the questions do get fairly difficult and really require the multi-step questions, and they require you to kind of conceptually reason. The ACT doesn't. I would say another big difference, following from another point that I made, is in terms of reading comprehension. So I think that's a big distinguisher. Um, so students with, better vocabularies, just generally stronger critical thinking skills, abilities to analyze complicated texts, will generally do well on the SAT, or rather, students who don't have that, that's a very, very difficult thing to tutor in 2 or 3 months, right? And so that would likely lead us in the direction of the ACT. Not that it's easy, but certainly the language is just more straightforward. And so even though the reading passages are longer, the questions about them are more straightforward. The passages themselves are more straightforward. That said, I'm thinking of a student I'm working with now who chose the SAT. She's maybe not the strongest at reading comprehension, but she just can't do the long reading passages on the ACT related to it, her neurodiversity, and so that just wasn't an option. And I've seen cases like that in the past where students usually really struggle with long passages. Small asterisk there, we do have strategies, to avoid reading whole passages, right? But that wasn't going to work with this particular student. There's more to say, but I think that the math difference and the reading comprehension difference are two of the bigger ones that I look at.
Thank you for that. Holly and Sheila, do you have anything to add?
Sheila mentioned this before, but I think the time difference, if a student is bumping up against time is a major challenge, and there's not an opportunity for accommodations or reason for it, the SAT gives you a little more time if they have that tolerance for the more puzzle-like nature of it. If you can get accommodations, then the ACT often works then. Because it is more straightforward and easier to keep attention focused on each little piece.
I'll just throw in that, I mentioned I do not tutor the new SAT. I used to tutor the SAT. I got my start on the SAT. I myself had a 1600 on the SAT when I was going to college. It used to be my jam, and then they went and changed it. They changed it many times, not just like this last change. There have been, I think, 16 changes since I applied. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe it's 8. It's been a lot. But I I like the ACT personally. Not every student is going to like it, but I like it because it's quite stable. You can teach a process, and if the student follows that process, it's going to work out. On the SAT, you can teach as much process as you want, and sometimes you just get thrown a weird set of questions. And it can be very hard to feel confident, feel prepared in the face of that. Of course, those questions will be a minority of the questions that they encounter. So, you know, you can still do very well on the test, but as a tutor, I like the stability of the ACT. I don't know if Holly and Andy have anything else to say about that because you guys actually tutor the SAT and I don't.
I'll I'm more and more coming around to yes to that position, and that's partly one thing that I've seen. This was sort of a growing hunch, but has become, you know, really I think a well-backed sort of belief at this point. It's easier for students to make progress on the ACT than the SAT. I think that's pretty close to a fact. And all the tutors I've talked to agree, and all of, you know, the numbers that I keep, you know, back that up. Exactly for the reason that Sheila just said, right? There's just known strategies, and if you do your work, and there's a lot of work to do, um, your scores will keep going up. And you just don't, unless a student really, you know, takes the you know foot off the pedal, they just keep going up. Right. And I've seen some remarkable, talk about these in a different context, but you know, some remarkable jumps on the ACT. You know, I think my record is 21 to a 34 out of 36. It took a lot of sessions, you know, it wasn't easy, but that sort of thing is possible. Not so much on the SAT. On the SAT, especially the new version, we're just finding that there's often a plateau, even with kids working really hard, and I think that has to do with the most difficult questions are going to be difficult no matter how much prep you do, because they're coming up with good questions, you know, and slightly new questions. The ACT will rarely surprise you.
I'll add, I've also felt that the scoring for the SAT, it feels a little idiosyncratic, and we don't really know what's going on behind that. And it's a lot. I mean, previously with that, the ACT was crystal clear how the scoring works. With the new format, um, I mean, since they published some of the scoring guides, it's a little more clear, like how many questions should you estimate to get right to get a certain score. Um, how many like that you have a little more clarity in the process of scoring. And I think for students that need that bit by bit motivation and see that incremental improvement to maintain confidence, that really helps. I think the SAT it can feel a little like you're rolling the dice.
Thank you for that. I'm curious if you've have any stories of starting to work with a student on preparing for one test and then ended up switching to another, and why you made that recommendation to switch. Do any students come to mind?
I'll just jump in since this is exactly it's the student I was talking about with made the huge jump on the ACT. We started on the SAT. This was a couple of years ago, so I don't remember exactly why we began on the SAT. And you know, she made nice progress, but then we hit that wall, and it just, you know, I felt we all felt that it just, you know, it's just going to be hard to break that next barrier, get to that next echelon. And so we switched to the ACT, and eventually, yeah, we got to where we wanted. And I've done that with a few students, and I can't say I've ever gone the other way, actually.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe once or twice, but yeah, I think that also speaks to just generally having more success on the ACT.
I think the only time I've ever had a student switch from ACT to SAT was because of like a timing conflict. Like the weekend that their ACT was going to be, they had to be, I don't know, playing at Disneyland for some concert or something. I don't know, something they really couldn't miss, and so we pivoted. But I think that, like it's only those logistical things that come up for me when we make that change.
Interesting. Um, and Do you have any stories of students who were convinced that they were just bad at testing before they started? And what changed for them? I see Holly, you nodding along. Do you have one off the top of your head?
Yeah, I was thinking, I just had one recently that was like, oh, I'm bad at testing, struggling with testing anxiety. She got extra time secured, so administratively we took care of some things that could help her. But I think working on building confidence through taking practice tests was a big thing. And then just kind of, I don't know if I have like wonderful learnings from it. It just like it sparked a moment. But like I mean, most recently, like she really surpassed her expectations for her score, and will continue doing test prep. But it was what was needed to just sort of I'd say like buckle in and understand that it's like okay, you've done the prep, you've seen the questions, you know the material. Now it's about your performance, and with that sort of mindset work, and having one successful test under her belt, I'm really excited to see how the student does for the next round and the possibility of super scoring.
Sheila, I saw you nodding too. Do you have a story to share?
I feel like this is every student. They're convinced they're bad at testing, even when they're scoring really well and they just can't, seem to go any higher. They're like, oh, I'm such a dummy. I'm never gonna get it. I'm, all the things, all the terrible things that they say to themselves, right? So I've definitely had a number of students. In some cases, there's an undiagnosed learning challenge that, we can help them navigate. In some cases, um, they already have a diagnosis, but for whatever reason, we're denied the accommodations. I've written so many appeal letters. I don't think I've had a single one that's ever failed because I just know the language that they're looking for. But I think probably one of my best stories is actually not a student that I tutored. Andy, you tutored her. She was one of my admissions students who, like, she went into a practice test, the very first practice test, just like shaking in her boots. She didn't finish half the questions. She was just like, she gave up before she got to like section three. She was just like, this is not it. To the point that her parents were like, you know what? Even if she can score well, we don't want to put her through this. And I was like, I get it. Like, this is a lot of anxiety. But when we looked at her score report, which if you do our diagnostic process, you will get a really beautiful score report and we'll walk through it with you. We looked at in particular her reading section, which is the one that she started to sort of fall apart on. Um, she got every single question right until she ran out of time. And she looked at that and was like, well, that's evidence that I'm never going to do well. I can't, do better than this. And I was like, no, no, no. It's evidence that you know how to do this test. You have the empirical reasoning ability. You understand what they want you to do. We just got to figure out what's slowing you down, right? And then, Andy, to your credit, you figured that out with her. And she came back with a 36 on her very first test. Um, and it was just amazing. And Holly, you said this when you were talking about why you love test prep. It's something that they can see their confidence sort of building incrementally in, and that's exactly what happened with this student. Right, the testing was sort of at the beginning of our admissions work together, and it just fueled her confidence and made her see what was possible. It was really a really beautiful transformation.
I love hearing that story. It's one of my favorites.
So do I, because I forgot all about that. So, I'm gonna
Good
go
job, Andy.
through. Yeah, that was a good one. Um, I'm working with a student now. I'm actually meeting her right after this, whose parents warned me that the whole family is genetically averse to test taking, um, which, let's say is true, but now she also has that, context, right? So then it becomes kind of self-fulfilling. Um, Anyway, because I also do academic coaching, and I've done a lot of reading up on anxiety and various, neurodivergences. I've gotten better at, figuring out, what the actual issue is, right? Sort of bad test taker is that doesn't really mean anything, right? That's sort of a symptom of some underlying thing. Often it's anxiety. Or it could just be like they just remember the one state mandated test and they did horribly, and who knows why, right? And then they just develop this belief that they don't take tests well. But I think most of that gets dispelled as you start just working on stuff, as you give them strategies, right? You just demystifying the tests, right? It's just not as bad as you think it is. There are all sorts of shortcuts and really smart ways to move through a test. And then you tend to just see it disappear and you don't really doesn't really come up again, right? It's like, well, the proof is in the pudding. You're not a bad test taker, you know. But occasionally I've also had, just bad test takers, right? Like just the multiple choice format, the kinds of questions that are being asked is just doesn't work for them. And, that's nobody's fault. Again, I don't think any of us are under the illusion that these are IQ tests. And well, IQ tests are their own problem, but are any sort of real marker of overall intelligence. So it doesn't have to. It's just the case for some people, and we would probably recommend give it a shot certainly. But if we're not seeing any progress, would probably recommend test optional. But again, that's very much the minority.
Thank you for these. I'm also seeing some questions being posted in the chat. I want to assure you we will get to them. I just have a couple of things that I want to ask our panelists before we go to the question and answer section from our audience. I do want to touch upon timing here because I know that preparing for a standardized test while you're also in school can be a huge stressor for families. So I want to ask you all what does an ideal testing timeline look like? Like when do you think students should sit for their first exam? I'll ask Sheila. What do you think?
Thank you. I really love it when we can be done with testing in the fall of junior year before things start to get really crazy. Which does mean you have to have a little foresight. So, many of you are parents of sophomores, and we like to give you this information now so that we can start the diagnostic process and put a testing plan in place where you have a long window for prep, right? Because we don't actually need the score until the fall of your senior year, but please do not wait until then to start thinking about it. Prep takes 3 to 4 months. Most students do take it twice, so tack on another month or 6 weeks after that. And then you've got, classes to deal with, extracurricular sports schedules, the musical, family vacation, the time just goes. So if we can start early and put a plan in place, then you're going to be in your best position to make, intentional choices. So I love it when a student can take their diagnostics at the end of sophomore year or the very beginning of the summer after and actually prep over the summer. And for certain students, they'll be ready for their first test in August or September, depending on which test they're taking. But for me, my ideal state is we've got our test score done by December. It's locked in and we can move on and do other things.
Indy, Holly, anything to add?
Depending on the math level of the student. So usually at that point, if they've had at least algebra 2 and trigonometry, and pre-calc can be helpful just to I don't know, amp up some of the critical reasoning. But I'd say the minimum, if the student hasn't completed algebra 2 and trig, then toward the end of sophomore year may feel too early for them and might actually make them stressed out or just feel like they're worse at the test, especially the math, than they are.
Makes a lot of sense. And then do you have a story about any students where early testing made a difference in reducing stress later on in their process? I can think of.
I'm full
Oh,
of
yeah.
stories.
Mhm.
I have one from last year. Andy, you actually supported on the essays for this guy. And I encouraged them to start their testing early. He prepped all summer with me and then took his first test, I want to say in October. And when we got his score, he texted me, I don't know what happened. And then it was like the 3 dots forever. I'm like, what are you going to tell me? I don't know. But he got a 35. And I was like, oh, God, that's great news. And then he was done with testing, and thank God, because this kid was really dragging his feet on his essays. And if we were worrying about writing essays while prepping for the ACT, neither one of those things would have happened well. I mean, we were working on essays up until the last minute. It was pretty intense. Um, and so, you know, it's not like we could say what the stress would have been. I can only imagine. But we definitely did the right thing by pushing him to test a little earlier.
I was thinking about kind of the opposite situation. It's honestly not my story to share, but the student worked with you, Andy, on test prep and with one of our consultants, Joanna, on admissions. And he was facing the conflict of preparing for a test, writing his essays, and pulling together all of his applications on top of a very busy extracurricular dance schedule. Um, and it led to a lot of conflict in the home, tension amongst him and his consultant, and a lot of stress for him, just because he wasn't taking it seriously, the prep. Which leads me to, I think, one final question before we move into the next section. What do you think the biggest mistake families and students make in preparing for their testing? Mm.
I could jump in. I'm not sure about mistakes that families make. I guess other than not starting earlier, not that that's their fault, right? But but it is, as we just heard, better to start earlier. Um, the students who don't get much out of test prep are the ones who can't, are unable to, or unwilling to really treat it like another class, or maybe the equivalent of two classes, right? They have so much going on, and I have a lot of sympathy for that. Um, between classes and extracurriculars and the rest of their lives and everything. Very hard to carve out time that's dedicated to this. Very easy to either not do the assignment that I set them, or to do it at the last minute under far from ideal circumstances. And those are the students who, no surprise, are just going to kind of creep along and not really reach, their potential on either test. Um, so, as a result, my particular approach is geared toward helping them, and I sort of put my academic coach hat on and help them find time in their schedules. And, we talk about what I call good practice hygiene, so it's like anything else, right? I mean, if you're, to steal Sheila's go-to metaphor, if you're an elite athlete, your practice is elite as well, right? So you don't just show up to the match or the game, right? You practice as hard, and exactly like um, the conditions of the game. And so that's what I stress, and then you see results when that happens. It's that simple.
Thank you for sharing that, Andy. Holly and Sheila, anything to add here about mistakes that you see students make?
And sometimes there's a scheduling hiccups and things with intention. So, we might roughly block off like, okay, we will prep for 3 months and then there'll be a test in fall. Great. But make sure you check what the exact test dates are. Those are published usually a year in advance. When you're able to register for them due, I think it's gotten a lot better, but a few years back, there were some people who had to travel from Boston to Maine to take a test. It was bad. So making sure that it's a comfortable location, giving yourself time to get accommodations approved if you think that might be necessary as well. Just by starting looking at the test dates and working backwards with those things in mind, I think will really help the student take it seriously as well, because they'll know it's like, okay, this has been planned for and it's locked in. And it's not hard to cancel if you have to, but it's better to really get them to take it seriously and know that that's part of a well thought out plan.
Good point.
I think that what Andy and Holly brought up are exactly like spot on, and I really hope you heard them. And if you didn't, go back to the recording, listen to it again, because those are two of the biggest things I think that you need to know. A third thing that I'll bring up here is that a lot of people think that you could just walk into a test. Like they're doing well in school, they'll be fine. And if only it were that simple. I wish it were. Maybe in some future form of the college admissions process, it will become that simple, but that is not where we live. It's not reality. The reality is these tests are different than schoolwork, from schoolwork, excuse my grammar. And it is important to practice. It is important to know what you're walking into. It is important to think about the timing. Holly, you mentioned the kind of performance aspects of all of this. And that's something that I really stress, especially for students aiming for top scores. It's in the mindset, and it's in the practice hygiene. It's in doing what your tutor told you to do. My God. But it's knowing what you're getting into before you get into it. So that's what all of this is here for. Hopefully, you're getting some picture of what this is going to take, and then we can do the diagnostic process, and your student can see what these tests are like and decide. Based on real data, if they're good or not good at testing, if they like this test or that test, if they're actually scared of science or not. Let's actually get some data.
Um, so I'm seeing one question from Lack about what our guidance is on the SAT Superscore versus regular score for someone targeting a highly selective university in a STEM field. Sheila, do you have any guidance around that?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one quickly. You really got to look at the university. I mean, I'm pretty sure all universities, all top, these elite universities that you're looking at, will super score the SAT, but you really want to double check their testing policy because some of them may not super score. Um, Colleges don't care if it's a super score or a regular score if they accept a super score. I've talked to so many admissions officers who tell me I wouldn't even know how to get to their full score report. I only see what our admissions software shows us. And if that software is programmed to show them a super score, that's what they're going to see and that's what they're going to look at. They're not digging in to see did they do this across three tests or was it in one because somehow doing it in one is more valuable. They're not doing that. So hopefully that answers that question. There's a second part here of does preparing for the SAT help with the PSAT? Yeah, they're the same test. I never tell people to prep for the PSAT, but if you're already prepping for the SAT, it will help you on the PSAT. So I encourage you to get your goals clear, right? No college sees the PSAT score. You could win a scholarship with the PSAT in your junior year, but it is a very small scholarship and it is highly competitive. You're much better off studying for the SAT, not studying for the PSAT. But sounds like a call might be useful here. So, talk to us.
And then I'm also seeing a comment about accommodations and how difficult it is to get accommodations for testing on a student with neurodiversity or learning disabilities. Um, I'm not sure who has the most experience in this area. Sheila, I know you've done it a couple of times.
I know it's probably me, but aren't you guys tired of hearing from me? I mean, come on. Holly's like, no. Okay, so if it's diagnosed, it should not be hard. You might get the runaround. You might get the runaround from your school. You might get the runaround from the College Board or the ACT. But it is always possible if the diagnosis is valid, and you have a good practitioner on your side, and you have someone like me that you can call to say, Sheila, how do I do this? I will help you through. So the most common accommodation is extra time. It's usually time and a half, 1.5x. I've seen people get 2x. I've seen people be granted the accommodation to take this test over multiple days, like one section a day or two sections a day. Some people with vision challenges get large print. You could get a reader. There are lots of different types of accommodations, and by law, they need to try their best to meet what your diagnosing clinician says your student requires. So there's a lot of kind of making matches between what the challenge is and what the accommodation would be. But if you have deeper questions about that, that definitely warrants a phone call. So we would be happy to talk you through that.
Thank you. Any other questions? um, from the audience before we sign off for the night?
I think I see one about how far in advance. Um, oh, that was answered by Sheila in the chat.
Mhm.
Sorry. Okay, what's wrong?
Don't be shy. We probably have time for one more question.
I feel like this is not in the chat, but it's probably something a lot of families are dealing with. Like parents are like, okay, I see, we need to do it. But the kid does not want to do anything. It can be very hard to convince them to take a test. It can be very hard to convince them this is necessary. I'm really interested what Holly and Andy have to say about how do we get your kid on board?
I think talking about goals, the why are we doing this? So if they have a dream school, they have an image of where they want to be, and they understand how this test can help them get there. To me, that's the biggest carrot that we can come up with. Otherwise, it does feel like, I'm just doing it because my parents told me to, and none of my friends are doing it.
Oh, we have another question from Michelle.
Mhm.
Optimal number of times to take the test.
Andy, what would you say? Optimal number of times to take the test, SAT or ECT?
There is no optimal number. I could tell you an average student probably takes it 3 times. I don't know, somewhere around there. Um, you know, one and done is wonderful. I guess that's optimal. If you can nail it the first time, that's the minority of cases. And then, if you're going on number 5 and you're not seeing movement, then probably, you know, um, probably not going to happen on the 6th, So there, at some point you do want to sort of, cry uncle and move on.
Thank you. Well, everyone, thank you so much for coming this evening. I know that, and we all know that the testing landscape can be really stressful and overwhelming. So I'm hoping that this session tonight provided some clarity and some answers and was helpful. As I mentioned, you all will get a link to the recording afterwards. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Good night, everybody.